Thank you for joining the virtual Carsey Conabad Air Base Community Forum. I'm Elizabeth Irvin, the Director of the Office of Community Health Hazard Assessment at the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR. ATSDR, along with the Department of Veterans Affairs, are hosting this first K2 Community Forum, and I will serve as a moderator for today's session. Next slide, please. So as we kick off today's meeting, please keep your microphones muted throughout the session. We have quite a packed agenda today, as we will cover the Megabus Act, followed by a summary of the Contaminants of Concern report. We will then have an overview of the community forums and a presentation on the K2 surveillance program, an update on the depleted uranium testing, and on the Department of Defense's K2 efforts. Lastly, we will provide an overview of the questions received through the Rally Point site. For today's session, we do not have an open question and answer session, so please write any questions in the chat box. These questions will be compiled and responses will be posted on the VAK2 website. Next slide, please. I will now turn it over to Dr. Joel Culpepper. Dr. Culpepper is the Deputy Director of the Epidemiology Program and Health Outcomes of Military Exposures and designed and is managing the K2 surveillance program. He has over 25 years affiliation with the VA as a university faculty and a VA employee, with an emphasis on military environmental exposures impacts on health. He will provide an overview of the Megabus Act. Dr. Culpepper, are you on the line?
Oh, yes, I am. I'm trying to get my mic. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Great.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry. Good morning, and thank you all for joining. If we could have the next slide, we'll jump right in here. So to start off with, we'll talk about the National Defense Authorization Act, which did direct the Department of Defense to conduct some K2 related activities. And specifically, they were tasked with conducting an epidemiologic study to determine the health effects associated with deployment to K2. The Department of Defense has started that process. They have a contract in place with the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, and they will be responsible for the design and conduct of that study. At the current time, the funding has been allocated and is in place. The Johns Hopkins team has hired their staff to support this effort. They've got all of their credentials, through the VA so that they can access the appropriate data systems, and specific data requests, have been submitted. And according to the latest word from, the Johns Hopkins team, that they anticipate having a final report back to the Department of Defense by at least December of 2024. Next slide. The other piece of legislation, and the one that affects, VA, was, Public Law 116.315, which we referred to as the Megabus Act, and in particular, Section 2010, which directed VA to enter into a contract with our colleagues at ATSDR, at CDC, and to study the health effects, at K2, and specifically asked the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registries to reevaluate the data that were collected as part of the environmental site surveys that were done during the K2 occupation. There were 3 different surveys there, and we'll talk more about that later, but it was, area sampling, air, water, soil types of samples. And so those were reevaluated. And we'll talk more about the findings from that report a little bit later today. But that report was finalized and submitted to Congress in January, of this year. Additionally, we were to establish, this sort of communication, these community forums where we can share with the K2 community and particularly the K2 veterans what we're doing and what progress we're making. And so this is the first in that step, and we plan to have, others, clearly in the future. And then the final part of this legislation was to, better define the health effects associated with K2. And I will talk in greater detail the plans that we have put in place and the process that we currently have underway to do just that. But we have a responsibility to have a final report on that to Congress in March of 2030. And I will make sure that links to these pieces of legislation for those that would like to read, the original wording, and we'll put that on our website along with, responses to questions. So that's the end of this particular section, and back to you, Dr. Irving.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Culpepper. Next slide, please. Our next presenter is Ms. Karen Scruton. Ms. Scruton is a section chief for the Exposure Investigation section at ATSDR. The Exposure Investigation section provides data analytics support and conducts biological and environmental sampling to evaluate public health concerns at or near hazardous waste sites. In her presentation, she will provide a summary of the Contaminants of Concern report. Karen?
Thank you very much. And good morning. Again, my name is Karen Scruton, and I am the section chief for the Exposure Investigation section at ATSDR. And I will be providing you with information on the identification of historical potential contaminants of concern, or COCs, at the K2 Air Base in Uzbekistan. Next slide, please. So a little background on the site, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The K2 Air Base in Uzbekistan, also called Camp Stronghold Freedom, was a Soviet-era air base used for support missions in Afghanistan. The U.S. military operated the base from 2001 to 2005 with just over 15,000 service members deployed. So pursuant to the Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Improvement Act of 2020, the VA entered into an agreement with ATSDR to prepare a report on the exposures at K2 and to assess potential health effects associated with contaminants found at K2 to inform the K2 surveillance program. Next slide, please. So for the data evaluation, environmental samples were taken on the K2 base in the areas noted on the map. So sampling results were extracted from historical documents from 2001 to 2004, and those documents were produced by the Army Center for Health Promotion and Preventative Medicine Europe, CHPPM. So ATSDR reviewed all the data in the reports, and the COCs identified from our screening process were organic and inorganic compounds. I'll discuss the screening process and the COCs identified from the screening process later in the presentation. But I also wanted to provide information on other contaminants we reviewed but did not identify as COCs. Those would be asbestos, we looked for in air and water. Radiation, we evaluated the results from air, water, and soil. Pesticides and inorganic arsenic were evaluated from surface wipes and sound. Next slide, please. So all data were screened using ATSDR screening levels. So ATSDR, the organic and inorganic compounds were identified as contaminants of concern. Organic compounds include volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds, also called VOCs and SVOCs. And inorganic compounds include naturally occurring metals or elements. The term organic just means that the compounds contain carbon. The additional chemicals that were evaluated, as outlined on the previous slide, were not identified as COCs for the reasons below. So for asbestos, all the asbestos samples were below occupational standards. Radiation data were within the range of background levels in the area. Pesticides were below detection limits in surface wipes. And inorganic arsenic, we had no screening levels in surface wipes, but we did evaluate arsenic in water and soil. And sound was of concern based on flight operations. Next slide, please. So for the ATSDR screening process, I'd like just to go over how ATSDR's screening process differs from the screening process used by the military. So the historical documents did identify contaminants of concern, or COCs, based on comparison to military environmental guidelines, or MEGs. So MEGs are used by the military to identify COCs for military personnel, and were used to screen the K2 data in those 2001 to 2004 reports. ATSDR used current screening levels that are based on protecting residential adults and not military personnel, and therefore are usually lower than the MEGs. So maximum concentrations identified in each medium from the historical documents were compared to ATSDR's health-based screening levels. So contaminants with maximum concentrations above ATSDR screening levels were identified as contaminants of concern. Now, obviously, we identified additional contaminants of concern when we compared to what was identified in the original documents, because ATSDR screening levels are lower, generally lower than the MEGs originally used. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk you through 6 tables that provide the COCs identified from ATSDR's screening process and the health effects associated with each COC. So again, the screening process identified COCs that were organic and inorganic chemicals. The potential health effects listed on these tables are health effects that have been found to be associated with exposure to each chemical. Scientists use information collected from both human and animal studies to identify potential health effects for a chemical. The table notes what kind of study was used to identify each particular health effect, human or animal. And for animal, it's primarily rats and mice. So a chemical can have non-cancer or cancer effects, or both. These are listed on the table with screening levels for cancer effects usually lower than those for non-cancer. So it's not unusual for a screening level for cancer, but not non-cancer, to be exceeded by the maximum concentration. I do want to emphasize as we go through these tables that even if someone has been exposed to these chemicals, it does not mean they will develop these health effects. Again, the intention of the COC identification was to help the VA inform their K2 surveillance program. And finally, the table indicates with an X which medium the chemical was found in above screening levels, with medium being air, water, soil, or gas that has been generated from soil. So for arsenic, which is an inorganic chemical, the maximum level found in water and soil was above the screening level for cancer, but not for non-cancer. For benzene, which is a VOC, the maximum level in air and soil gas was higher than the screening levels for both cancer and non-cancer health effects. And benzoate-pyrene is a semi-volatile organic. It was found to exceed screening levels in air and soil. Next slide, please. Then we have bromodichloromethane and chloroform, which are both volatile organics. Their maximums exceeded the screening level in water. And cadmium and chromium, which are inorganics or metal, also exceeded the screening levels in water. Now for chromium, there are several forms of chromium. So to be health protective, we listed effects associated with the form that has more health effects than other forms. Next slide, please. So copper is a metal that was found to exceed the screening level in water. Cumene is a volatile organic, and that exceeded the screening level in soil gas. And di-2-ethyl hexylphthalate is a semi-volatile, and that exceeded the screening levels in soil. Next slide, please. Then we come to a couple more volatile organics, ethylbenzene, kerosene, and methylene chloride. And these exceeded in air or soil gas, and with methylene chloride also exceeding in soil. And lead, which I think most people know is a metal that is of concern, especially for young children, and that did exceed the screening level for water. Next slide, please. So we have naphthalene, a semi-volatile organic, exceeding the level for air. And then we have particulate matter, which is just what it sounds like, particles in the air. And the PM10 is just the size of the particle that they sampled for. And that did exceed also in air. Total phosphorus is an element that was found to have the maximum exceeding in water. Next slide, please. And so the final three are all volatile organics, tetrachloroethylene, the trimethylbenzenes, and xylenes. They all exceeded in air and or soil gas. Next slide, please. So this provides a listing of the additional COCs that resulted from the ATSDR screening. As I indicated, our values were lower than the MEGs, so these were the additional contaminants that we did found to exceed, and they are presented in our report. Again, they are the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, the semi-volatile organic compounds, and the inorganics. And 2 contaminants were identified from the MEGs and not from our screening. So screening levels do evolve. That was about 20 years ago. Screening levels do evolve as more information is gathered, and the maximum levels did not exceed our current screening levels. Next slide, please. So we know that uranium and radiation are of concern to the K2 community, so we just wanted to have a separate slide to present that information. So depleted uranium, or DU, was identified in soil in 2001 at the former missile storage site, which is Site 1, which is outside the military protection berm area. And access to Site 1 was declared off limits from use in 2001. Now, radiation was measured in soil, air, and wipes within the military protection berm in 2001, and all results were either non-detect or considered to be below background levels. Next slide, please. So the conclusions and limitations we have from our report are that ATSDR does recognize that data at K2 are limited to specific areas at the base and times of testing and may not fully represent levels of exposure to contaminants by service members at K2. ATSDR did identify additional COCs in this report as compared to the K2 documents, because the screening levels used by ATSDR were generally lower than the MEGs. And the health effects associated with the COCs identified by the ATSDR screening were used by the VA for consideration in the K2 surveillance program, or the K2SP. Next slide. Thank you for attending.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Next slide, please. So our next presentation is on the community forums. Ms. Stephanie Eber is the program communicator for Health Outcomes Military Exposures. She carries out communication efforts to publicize office initiatives and research. Ms. Eber is the editor of 2 newsletters for veterans and updates the web content. Today, she will provide an overview of the community forums. Stephanie?
Thank you for that introduction. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of our communication efforts for K2. First, welcome to our first community engagement forum. You should have received a letter. The letter that you see in this slide and also an email was sent on June 13th. This letter invited you to the forum. It also contains information on how to get depleted uranium testing or toxic exposure screening, information about the K2 surveillance program, and additional resources. Over the next 10 years, we plan to hold these virtual community engagement forums yearly. We will provide information such as updates on the K2 surveillance program progress or updates on research and services. We will have additional meetings as needed when we have new reports to share or updates on legislation or services. We will be sending you mailings in the future with information about new meetings. Next slide, please. And please remember to mute your mics. So there's a few online resources you can go to for information and updates. First is VA's K2 webpage. So this page contains information on K2, and if you can't, I assume you can't click the link, but if you search public health, K2 and VA, that should pop up easily in a Google search. You've also had a chance to ask questions on Rally Point. So commonly asked questions and answers were gathered from Rally Point and will be posted on the VA K2 page. Also, VA's K2 page is where you can expect to find any additional information, such as any reports. So Rally Point is a social network for veterans and service members, and you would have needed to create a login and password to use it. And that's where from June 5th, as I said, from June 5th to 19th, we collected your questions on K2. And we will be using Rally Point to interact with you periodically in the future. And so in closing, just want to send a reminder to use the chat box if you have any questions. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Next slide, please. Dr. Culpepper will now provide an overview of the K2 surveillance program.
Okay, good morning once again. Could I have the next slide, please? So I talked briefly about this a little bit earlier. These are the pieces of legislation, that are kind of overseeing our K2 efforts. I will point out that, we had started and already began planning, the K2 surveillance program, before these pieces of legislation were enacted. And once they were, we had to make some slight modifications to meet the letter of the law. But now, that we've achieved that, we're up and running. I think the big thing that I want to point out here is specifically with regards to the K2 surveillance program was that, we were originally directed to do an epidemiologic study, which is kind of just a one-off cross-sectional study that provides valuable information, and has, advanced our understanding of military exposures, health effects, historically. But in this particular instance, we did not feel that that was really the way to go, that we truly needed a surveillance program, and I'll provide details of that. And the main rationale being is that, it was relatively short follow-up from K2, and it was a relatively young group of individuals. And so concerns were that if we did a study today, that's probably not going to give us a complete picture of what may be going on, that we need a true surveillance approach where we do this repetitively over the next, 8 to 10 years to make sure that we are very thorough in our evaluations and identify, all of the possible health effects that may be associated with deployment at K2. So that's the general approach and rationale for, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we will be looking at morbidity, kind of chronic disease and cancers, as well as mortality, probably every other year for the next 10 years or so. Next slide, please. So I won't belabor this. I'm sure everybody on the call, is aware of K2, where it was located and what its purpose was. We'll note that there were 3 different environmental site surveys that were conducted during the period of occupation, and, the obvious things, heat, noise, and particulate matter, were clearly there. And then here's a listing, of other things that were identified during those environmental risk assessments. And as you just heard earlier from Ms. Grunton, that, we took that information, reevaluated it, comparing it to today's modern health criteria and standards, and identified some additional contaminants that, we're concerned about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. In about 2011, 2012, DOD, conducted a study to look to see what was going on with the K2 cohort. And they published this in 2015. That study was limited to active duty service members, that were regular Army. It excluded, reservists and National Guard. And it compared them to a similar group of veterans that were stationed at South Korea during that same occupation timeframe, the 2001 to 2004, 2005. And, they had mixed results, in many instances, disease, was, no different or slightly lower in the K2. The only conditions of concern there that were found were melanoma and cancers of the lymphatic and hematopoietic tissue, Hodgkin's lymphoma as an example. And so they showed a higher incidence in for those 2 cancers in the K2 group. But, we were concerned because there was only a small number of those cancers, only 7 and 6, respectively. And so not conclusive results. However, the fact that we were seeing those types of cancers in a relatively young group of individuals was quite concerning. And that really then set us in VA on the path of, okay, what do we do about this? These folks are coming to us shortly, and we need to be prepared to better understand what's going on, and thus led to the beginnings of the K2 surveillance program. Next slide, please. So what is the surveillance program? As was noted earlier, we spent probably close to a year working with our DOD colleagues and several entities within VA, VBA, to adjudicate, the roster and identify to the best that we could all of the folks that actually were stationed and garrisoned, at K2 during that time frame. And, after we went through that process, we feel confident, that these roughly 15,000 individuals, were actually there. And we further refined that group, at least for analytical purposes, to look at, the roughly 9,900 that were there on site at K2 for a minimum of 28 days, with the rationale being that they would have some minimal amount of exposure, whatever that might be at the K2 site, where we might see some sort of a health effect. And typically when we looked at the kind of the distribution of those, that had less than 28 days, the vast majority of them were 2 and 3 days. And so those were those folks, that maybe flew in to do an inspection, to provide, specialty medical care, and then flew out, but didn't actually stay at the K2 location for any length of time. So those are how we've identified the population. We took, and then using that entire roster of the 15,000, said, now we need to figure out some comparison groups so that we can make sense of what's going on at K2 and what is our best strategy. We don't have exposure measurements at the individual level that would help us quantify, what contaminants, how much of a contaminant somebody was exposed to. That kind of data is still challenging. And work proceeds to try and address that, but that's obviously a talk for a different venue. For us, as we thought through things, we said, okay, well, we know that K2 was in Southwest Asia. It would be good to have a cohort of similar veterans that also deployed to Southwest Asia, but never to K2. And that way we could kind of control and rule out the general effects from just being in a combat environment in the Southwest Theater of Operations. And then for a second comparison group, we said, well, we really need to then rule out, those who would just have, kind of the background military exposures that might confer some adverse health effects. And so we identified another group that served during the OEF era, but were never deployed to anywhere in Southwest Asia. And this then we hoped would allow us to compare, disease risk between those three groupings so that we could then see if there was a pattern that would indicate, that disease was more associated with K2, or was it more associated with just being in Southwest Asia, or just being in the military. And so that was our initial strategy. We then, for each comparison groups, we selected 5 individuals for every one that was in the K2 group, which provides us a nice large sample of individuals that makes, our statistics more robust and help us, with identification of potentially rare conditions and diseases as well. And we matched these comparison groups on age, sex, race, branch of service, component, and their VA utilization status, because we know that all of those variables, relate to or have been associated with disease outcomes. And so we can now show that the makeup of the K2 group and is matched to the comparison groups, and so that those factors are kind of minimized, and that whatever results we see are for the most part related to their exposure experience at the different locations. So we've created this longitudinal database that tracks health outcomes based upon health encounter data. And for the first time, we are able to go back to 2000, FY 2000, and start identifying disease outcomes in service members and veterans all the way through the present. This required us to access the DoD healthcare system data, And it's taken a while for DOD and VA to work out the linkages, to share that information, but it is in place and we now have that. And so that's what we've done. We have built that linkage across that time and actually have data from 2000 through a complete of 2022. And we will update this on an annual basis moving forward, so that we keep, that database up to date and current, with the most readily available information. The advantage of combining these, obviously, we're able to get information on health outcomes so that we can look in the short term, so we can look at acute effects, as well as the long-term effects that may not present until, 15, 20 or more years later, while under VA care. We're also going to add to this, mortality data, which comes from the National Death Index. And that is, the gold standard data source for cause of death, contributing cause of death, and date of death, that is in this country. And that information is available on all veteran service members going back to 1979. And so this covers, the entire K2 surveillance, population. I will note that using the healthcare encounter data, we don't have coverage on 100% of the K2 surveillance program population. Not everybody chooses to use VA for their health care. However, what we've seen in this instance is that a majority do. And so combining the two data systems, and the DOD data includes Campus TRICARE, so it covers, retirees. We have complete coverage on 85% of the complete surveillance population, which is, in many instances, almost 2 times as good a coverage as we've had, with earlier cohorts, where there's been, a less or a lower rate of users within the VA system. So that still will give us, ample sample size for meaningful and robust analyses. As noted earlier, we will conduct these analysis. The first morbidity, kind of the chronic disease analysis is underway as we speak. I plan to have, a final report on that by the end of the summer, that, will then go out for peer review publication. And then, we will be looking, once that's accepted, share that back out with, this group and maybe in a similar, forum, but that is to be determined. Once that's completed, we will immediately move to our first mortality, analysis, and hope to have that, if we can stay on track, data analysis, and a report completed by the end of the calendar year, and then look sometime in the spring to have that published and ready for, wide dissemination. And then we'll repeat these, as I noted earlier. I think, whatever findings come to light during these first initial assessments, are important, and we need to document and find out what's going on. But just because we don't see an effect at this particular point, I think, we need to keep looking. I think, like I mentioned, it's a relatively young group, it's relatively short follow-up, and there just may not have been enough time yet for, chronic diseases, some cancers, that we know have long latencies, for those to be manifest. And so that's the rationale, again, for the surveillance approach here. And we will repeat, the morbidity and the mortality analysis at least every other year, moving forward, until we hit that kind of 2020 or 2030 timeframe, when a final report is due. And hopefully by that point, we will have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. As we are moving over the next, 10 or so years, as I mentioned, we will update these data on an annual basis. And part of that rationale is to make sure that, we have current data readily available, but then it also allows us to promptly respond to any emerging health concerns that may come to light. We know that, there may be, new exposures, we may see a big rush of claims for a certain condition that we haven't appreciated or been aware of. And, with the surveillance program set up the way that it is, I think we'll be able to respond to those, in a relatively rapid way. Next slide, please. So here, I just want to share some of that. There we go. The activities, that we've been engaged with. You will hear more about the DU program after this talk, from my colleague, Dr. Gatens. But we have in place, and it has been in place, since the Megabus Act was put in place, that DU testing is available to all K2 veterans at no cost. If you desire the test or your provider thinks that it's inappropriate, then it is available, and Dr. Gatens will provide more details on how to go about getting that and what's involved there. But there've been 138 K2 veterans that have requested and submitted a urine sample for the DU test, and we have results on 135 of those. And so far, all of those, have a negative isotopic signature. So to date, no evidence of DU in the K2 veterans. Also, as part of the Megabus and follow-up legislation, the K2 is now an eligible location for enrollment in the Airborne Hazards Open Burn Pit Registry. And that is slated to go live in October of this year. And so for those of you that are interested, in the letter that we sent out, and we'll be sure to include links, in our website where we post these slides and other questions, on the link where to go to register if that's of interest to you. As Ms. Eber noted, these community engagement panels we will hold at least annually, moving forward over the next 10 years. And then we will convene, other meetings, once we have results or if there's new legislation or, some other new information comes to light. Somebody has an open mic. Then we want to make sure that we get that out. We will send out, mail, through a letter to alert folks, of those impending events. We'll follow up with emails for those for whom we have a legitimate email, and then encourage all of you that receive those communications, please share them, with your K2 colleagues that we may not have reached. If they're not touching the VA system, then we really don't have a way, to garner, their contact information. And so that might be the case, but definitely feel free to share that. The other piece that we want to share is that, under PACT Act, K2 veterans are included for all those new presumptions, that have been implemented as part of PACT Act. Next slide, please. And so here's just, kind of the condensed list of all those conditions. As noted here, there's, respiratory cancers of any type, probably encompasses about 30 different specific cancers. So there's, a lot more conditions that are than shown here, like well over 300. So if unfortunately you have any of these conditions, then, we encourage you, to submit a claim. That information was provided, in the letter and the email. It will be posted, as responses to questions, and on our website, so that those, that do have concerns, can get that information and know who and where and how to contact VBA, to submit an appropriate claim. Next slide, please. I think that might be. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your time. And I will turn it back to Dr. Irving. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Culpepper. Next slide, please. Before Dr. Gayton's presentation, we're going to take a short break. And so we will join back at 10 a.m. Thank you.
I'm sorry to unmute, but real quick question. Do you know how long it takes for DU to stay relevant to one system?
If you can please just put that in the chat, and then we will have a Q&A back on the K2 website. So just please put that in the chat, and then when the answers are posted, it will all be in the K2 VA website.
No, that's just like a cell phone cover.
United States, according to CDC, get sepsis.
Hello?
Hello, we're on break, and if you could please mute your mic.
West Jackson. What's it say?
Thank you, everyone, while we took a short break. So our next presenter, Dr. Gatens, serves as the director of the VA's Toxic Embedded Fragment Surveillance Center, which offers urine biomonitoring to veterans with retained fragments and is located at the Baltimore VA Medical Center. She is also a key member of the VA's Depleted Uranium, or DU, follow-up program team responsible for providing clinical care biomonitoring to veterans concerned about possible DU exposure. Today, she will provide a brief overview of the DU follow-up program and DU test results for K2 veterans. Dr. Gatens?
Thank you. So first, let me just say thank you for joining this morning and giving me the opportunity to talk with you and tell you a little bit about sort of DU in general, as well as what we can offer here at the Baltimore VA for the depleted uranium follow-up program and some of the lessons that we have learned over the years. And so next slide. So just to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same page and has the same basic understanding about depleted uranium. Depleted uranium is actually a byproduct of the uranium enrichment process through which some of the more radioactive isotopes of uranium are extracted and used for nuclear fuel. And it's the uranium that's left over from this process that's said to be depleted. And so it actually has 40% less radioactivity than natural uranium. And so there have been large quantities of DU that have been produced and stored. And so a number of military uses were developed to take advantage of DU's high density, availability, and relatively low cost. And because DU is a very dense material, we know that it is good at protecting our troops. And so it's been used in tank armor to increase resistance to enemy fire. But it's also been determined to be ideal for use in armor-piercing munitions because it has self-sharpening properties upon impact that allow it to penetrate armor more effectively than other metals. And so while DU has been around for a long time, it was used in battle for the first time during the 1991 Gulf War. So next slide. And this led to a number of exposure opportunities during the first Gulf War. And so first, there was a number of friendly fire incidents where U.S. tank crew members who were scouts up ahead of the troops were mistakenly fired upon with DU projectiles. And soldiers in these struck vehicles may have inhaled airborne DU particles or other combustion products, ingested DU particles as the particles were cleared from the lungs by coughing and swallowing, and or experienced wound contamination by DU. And so in addition, some crew members were left with multiple DU fragments scattered throughout their muscle and soft tissue. And so there were also a number of other exposure opportunities of concern, including inhalation of smoke containing DU particulates during a munitions depot fire, and exposure to DU that may have occurred when entering or salvaging vehicles that were hit by DU munitions. So next slide. Because of the concern about potential health effects associated with exposure to DU, especially for those who had retained fragments, the VA established the DU follow-up program at the Baltimore VA Medical Center in 1993. And at that time, the mission of our program focused on providing ongoing clinical surveillance for the friendly fire DU exposed Gulf War I veterans. And for the past 30 years, our program has followed approximately 80 veterans involved in these incidents, inviting them to come to Baltimore every 2 years for a very extensive evaluation. And we've learned a lot from this cohort who had DU exposure of high intensity. And so several of these individuals continue, in fact, to have ongoing exposure from retained DU fragments. And so even though we are only recently starting to see some evidence of decreased bone mineral density in those with retained DU fragments, those that are continuing to have an ongoing exposure compared to those who primarily had just an inhalation exposure, we have found no uranium-related health effects, especially in those who primarily had been exposed through inhalation. And so in 1998, the mission of our program was expanded to passively survey for exposure scenarios linked to DU and provide urine DU surveillance by mail to any Gulf War I veteran and even more recent veterans concerned about DU exposure. So next slide. So one of the first things that we had to do when our program was established was determine the best way to assess exposure. And so we evaluated a number of different methods to assess exposure to depleted uranium. And some of the things that we looked at was we investigated whole body radiation counting as a potential way to assess exposure, as well as the use of X-ray fluorescence to assess uranium in bone. However, I'd like to point out that measurement of urine uranium concentrations has been found to be the most sensitive method for detecting very low concentrations of uranium. So, for example, elevations in urine uranium concentrations were found to be superior to whole body radiation counting in Gulf War I friendly fire cohort, even among those who we know have DU embedded fragments in soft tissues. And also the X-ray fluorescence technique that we use to try to assess uranium in bone was found by health physics experts who perform these tests not feasible for uranium due to technical limitations of the method. And it's also a very complex test to perform and not suitable for high throughput population screening. And so the other important thing to note is that measuring urine uranium concentrations is the best way to assess uranium in the systemic circulation. And why this is important is because once uranium enters the circulation, it has the potential to cause adverse effects elsewhere in the body, including in target organs such as the kidney. And so the other thing about urine uranium is that collection of a urine specimen is non-invasive. And so therefore it poses no additional risks to an individual. And so we have very sophisticated analytical techniques that permit us to measure total urine uranium concentrations in very, very small quantities. We're talking in parts per billion range. And because we can measure uranium in such low concentrations, we can detect it in just about everybody's urine, because everyone is exposed to uranium primarily through their diet. But the great thing that we are able to do is we are able to determine if the uranium in the urine is from natural sources or a depleted source by measuring the U-235, U-238 isotopic ratio. Next slide. So any veteran who's concerned about DU exposure can work with their local VA provider to submit a urine sample to our program for testing. And we have established protocols for how this is to be done. And to really help make the ordering and tracking of these tests a little bit easier for VA providers who may not order many of these tests, we recently created an interfacility consult. And so local providers can submit an interfacility consult to our DU program here at the Baltimore VA. And then they would work with the veteran to complete a DU exposure worksheet. And so that's a questionnaire that asks about different exposure scenarios. And to obtain a spot urine sample using one of the DU urine collection kits that we provide to all of the local VA facilities. And that's what you see pictured here in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And so those kits that we send out to all of the VAs are very helpful because it gives the providers all of the material that is needed to collect the urine specimen to ship it back to our program, as well as very detailed instructions on how to do so. And then also that I should point out that the containers that we use in those kits, believe it or not, we test frequently to make sure that the containers themselves don't contain uranium and therefore have the potential to affect the urine testing results. So next slide. So currently over 7,300 veterans have submitted a urine sample to our program. So this is not just K2 veterans, but this is any veteran who's concerned about DU exposure.
I think so.
Oh,
And so
you have to.
and
We
so
have a hot mic.
We can't hear you speaking. For the speaker?
Doctor, can you turn off your mute?
Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so I'll start over. I'm not sure when it cut off, but currently we have over 7,300 veterans who have submitted a urine sample to our program. And as you can see here, only 5 individuals have had a positive DU isotopic signature indicating that exposure was from DU and not a natural source. And all of these individuals were involved in friendly fire incidents that involved DU munitions. These individuals were invited to come to Baltimore every 2 years and to be part of the ongoing surveillance efforts for the friendly fire cohort. And I should also point out that for the 7,300 samples submitted, total urine uranium concentrations outside the normal range have been a rare occurrence. And so this is important because any potential health effects that would be associated with uranium would be associated with the total amount of uranium present, regardless of the source. Next slide. And so what do we know about DU exposure at K2? Well, I think some of the speakers have already touched on this earlier this morning, but there have been several site assessments that were done at K2, and presented here on this slide is some of the information taken from those assessments. So in 2001, a site survey identified low radioactivity uranium, and then in 2002, A survey stated that very small amounts of processed uranium, which was later identified as DU of non-US origin, was present in an area, but it was located outside the perimeter of Camp Stronghold Freedom, and that the contaminated area was covered with clean fill in 2001. It was fenced off and marked off limits. And so based on the information gathered, it was determined that the uranium posed minimal health risks. So next slide. However, given the concerns raised and to make sure that we weren't missing any DU exposure opportunities as part of our surveillance efforts, we added a question to ask about service at K2 to the DU worksheet, which accompanies the urine sample submitted to our program via mail. Next slide. So many of you
Real
on this
quick,
call.
That uranium that was found there, that was yellow cake. That was not depleted uranium. And the reason I know is I was the guy that was there that collected the samples. So that was in a very dusty environment at the time. And when that stuff was found,
Sir?
there was trucks driving off.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to please mute your mic so that we can stay on schedule, and we will gladly take your comments and questions through the chat, please. Thank you.
That seems like a very valid comment right there from a person who was actually taking the samples. I'd like to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again. We're not taking question and answers during this session. If you could please put your questions or comments in the chat box. We'll be posting responses to those questions on the website. Thank you.
Thank you. So many of you on this call are recipients of the letter that was sent out that says if you are concerned about DU exposure, you can work with your local environmental health coordinator at your local VA facility, and they can assist you in submitting a urine sample to our program for testing. And again, there's no cost to you for doing so. And so to date, we have identified 138 K2 veterans who have submitted a urine sample to our program. And we know that these individuals were K2 veterans because they had answered yes to that question that specifically asked if they served at K2, or for those who completed the survey prior to us adding the question, they had written in responses to free text question that asked about why they were submitting a sample to our program. And so of the 138 who have submitted a urine sample, we have results for 135. So we still have results pending for 3 individuals. But overall, we have found that total urine uranium values fall within the reported ranges for the general population. And none of these individuals have had a positive DU isotopic signature. And so I think it's just important for us to be able to establish an individual's current urine uranium concentration, even if it is in the normal range, and be able to compare that to other exposed populations like the Gulf War I friendly fire cohort. And so just keeping in mind those that had the inhalation only exposure from those friendly fire incidents also tend to have what we would consider normal urine uranium concentrations. And so we have not to date found any uranium related health effects in this cohort. And so I think that this can be reassuring for potentially exposed veteran groups who were also potentially exposed to DU through inhalation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gatens. Next slide, please. Next, we'll have Colonel Douglas Badzik, who currently serves as the Director of Preventative Medicine in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Health for Health Policy Readiness and Oversight. Colonel Badzik is a board-certified preventive medicine physician with a Master's of Public Health in Occupational and Environmental Medicine. His previous assignments include 5 years as the Chief of the Defense Health Agency's Armed Forces Health Surveillance Division. Colonel Badzik will provide an update on the DoD's K2 efforts.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. As stated, Colonel Doug Badzik here. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to provide an update as far as what the department is currently doing with regards to the new K2 surveillance study as mandated by Congress per the NDAA 21 section 751. So we've already kind of covered, several other presenters have already covered what, as far as the background, as far as K2 goes. So I'm not going to belabor that point. But what I am going to also provide is kind of a background on some of the previous studies that the department has done, kind of summarize those studies, and then kind of outline where we stand as far as with this new, the new Section 751 study, where we currently stand on that and the potential end date for that. So the initial study done in K2 was actually conducted by the Army Public Health Center in 2010, and this was a result of, you know, almost immediately as most on the you know, call or tracking, there was concerns that were raised by various individuals and groups as far as adverse outcomes that were associated with folks that had deployed to K2. So Army Public Health Center in at that time Command in 2010 conducted the initial study. And at that time, they compared individuals who had deployed to K2 compared to individuals that had deployed to Korea during that same time. The study had significant limitations, and the outcomes of the study showed that, well, the result of the study were that there was no increase in cardiac symptoms, pulmonary symptoms, mental health, or cancers when they compared the K2 to the Korean cohort. But it stated there were a lot of concerns about that study, and it felt that that needed to be redone with a little bit more rigor. A follow-on study was done in 2015, again by Army Public Health Center, again comparing the K2 cohort with the Korean deployers. A little more rigor went into this study, and they kind of limited the time frame in which the study took place for the time when K2 was in operation, October of 1 through December of 5. Results were relatively similar in the sense that the study showed that K2 deployers had a lower incident of cardiovascular disease, a lower incident of pulmonary disease, lower incident of mental health, and the overall, by overall I mean like the total aggregate of cancers, were the same as those that were found and those that had deployed to Korea. However, there was a potential weak association that was found between individuals who deployed to K2 and a couple specific cancers, namely melanoma and lymphatic cancers. However, there were so few cases that the study actually lacked the ability to definitively go and create a causal relationship between deployment to K2 and these cancers. The study, you know, kind of concluded that, you know, additional work needed to be done, and this was just more of a initial hypothesis generating study. And that leads us to the NDAA of 2021.
Excuse me, the slides are not moving. If you could, are we progressing the slides?
Yeah, there are no slides. This is an audio. It takes us once again to National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, when Congress mandated that the department would conduct a study on exposures to toxic substances by members of the armed forces who were deployed to K2 during its period of operation. The department made a decision not to do this study internally, but rather to go and contract this out to one of our respected research partners. And as Dr. Culpepper said in his opening remarks, that the department is contracted with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. And Johns Hopkins is developing a study. It's a retrospective study looking at the health outcomes assigned to K2, looking for increased rates of specific cause mortality or disease, or morbidity, I'm sorry, and mortality as well. So I think a very fair question to ask is, why is this study going to be any different? Department has gone and, looked at two previous times, and yes, we're trying to get somebody a little bit more independent, but, why should we expect anything different this time? So when we look at the two previous studies that were done, by Army Public Health Center. The main way that the cases or the health outcomes were identified was looking at International Classification of Disease, or ICD-10 codes, and then through those coding, we were able to identify adverse outcomes such as cancer or pulmonary disease or whatever it may be. However, what was never looked at was free text with any medical record. So, for example, if a service member or retiree came into the system and said, "I have X, Y, or Z concern," and that information was contained strictly in the notes and wasn't actually coded with one of the ICD-10 codes, then we would not necessarily capture that case in one of the previous studies. And additionally, the VA data was never used, and this was probably even more problematic when we look at the previous studies, considering that at this point that the majority of K2 veterans have either separated or retired, and many of the conditions that we are looking at, many of the conditions of concerns, in particular cancer, may take years to develop. So if we were only looking at DoD data, we would never capture any of the individuals who separated, and maybe the conditions began to manifest after they retired. This also could have resulted in previous studies, underestimating the amount of impact that some of these exposures had. So going forward into this current study, we really tried to go and mitigate some of these previous identified gaps and limitations. And that really has kind of started with a collaboration with the VA. And as Dr. Culpepper, also stated, that some of the initial work that we did was actually a very robust collaboration with the VA to come up with a common roster, so that both the VA and the department were agreeing upon as far as who was deployed to K2. So looking at CENTCOM rosters, looking at other data sources to come up on agreed upon a source that's there. So where do we stand currently as far as the work? Johns Hopkins began the actual work on the study in the late fall of 2021, just kind of beginning their additional literature search. And as I said, the way that they are approaching the study is very different than previous. They are using ICD-10 cases, and in particular because that's where we have some of the best demographic data. But in addition to that, they are also using data from the VA electronic medical records. So the approach that Johns Hopkins is using is that they are actually developing some computer algorithms to actually go and work inside the VA electronic medical record enclave to actually use these algorithms to actually mine the free text within the records. So this is the intent here, is to go and individual, as I said, that may have complained of neurological symptoms, but that neurological symptom was never coded. But these algorithms should be able to go and pull these cases out and hopefully be able to have a more realistic snapshot of some of the potential conditions that are there. And then once again, be able to go and use this in the final analysis. So this is a long time, right? I mean, Johns Hopkins started the work back in the late fall of 21. We're already into 23, so that's like 18 months. And the reason is because setting up this study has been, because this is a novel approach, this hasn't been done before. This has just been very time intensive to get all the ducks in a row, as it were. We needed to make sure that the Johns Hopkins had the appropriate data use agreements between the VA and themselves, and then also the VA, rightly so, wanted to make sure that they had the appropriate safeguards and oversights, because as Hopkins is going to be working directly within the VA enclave, just wanted to make sure that there was appropriate oversight and that the medical records and that were appropriately safeguarded. So where do we stand currently? So everything is in place at this point in the game. So the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, they have all of the department's data, all of the demographic data, all the health records, and they also have we've provided them with all of the site surveys, everything that the Army had with regards to the K2 exposure data. So they also have the ability to go and look at the chemicals and the potential exposures of concern, and then to be able to develop their their algorithms saying, based on, potential exposure state to benzene, we would expect X, Y, and Z conditions to potentially result of that, and then use those conditions to look as they mine the data records. So we expect that Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab to actually beginning work on their extraction probably around the beginning of August. And so the process is probably going to take around 6 to 9 months to actually extract the data from the VA records, in part because it's going to have to be an iterative process. Depending on how well these algorithms work, they will probably have to rewrite them several times to make sure they're maximizing the extraction that's there. And then after we get the data out of the VA, we'll follow up and they will do the actual analysis, merging the VA and the DoD data, and then finally they will go and develop the report. So the report is estimated to be able to be provided to Congress sometime, late 2024, early 2025. That could potentially slide, but that's our best guess at this point in the game. And then just as a reminder that this is a report that actually was mandated by Congress. So the report from the study will be provided to Congress prior to it being released to the public. I have every confidence that after this is presented to Congress, that this will be released, publicly released. So that concludes my updates for the most part. I just would like to close just one quick thing. I know that there has been ongoing interest with regards to what actually was found at the K2 surveys that were conducted by the Army back in 2001 through 2004. And so I just want to make sure that everybody is tracking that this information, these declassified reports and surveys are available on the Army Public Health K2 website. So if you just go and Google Army Public Health Center K2, you'll find the link that will pop up at the top, and on that page it actually will find the links to all the declassified reports. One thing of note though, the Army Public Health Center is now under the Defense Health Agency, so it has been renamed. It's no longer called the Army Public Health Center. It's the Defense Center for Public Health Aberdeen, or DCPHA. So if you see that DCPHA, you are at the right place. That actually is the Army Public Health Center, at least legacy, and that's where all the K2 reports and declassified reports are located. That being said, that concludes my remarks, and I will be followed on by the next presenter.
Thank you, Colonel Badzik. Next slide, please. So lastly, Dr. Culpepper will provide an overview of the questions that were received via the Rally Point site. Dr. Culpepper?
Dr. Culpepper, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry. I apologize. I forgot to unmute myself. So as I was talking to myself, before we talk about any of the questions, I wanted to just touch base on an issue with the K2 surveillance program, and that really is, concerning the outcomes that will be assessed for the morbidity and mortality analyses. We have a very broad list of outcomes that we're evaluating, and those kind of originally began with health concerns that had been raised with the Southwest Theater of Operations in general, work that our office had done, work that collaborators and colleagues in DoD had done, and identified the possibility as these kinds of health outcomes. We also looked at VBA claims data and took the top 10 non-injury related reasons for submitting a claim and made sure that those were factored into our outcome list. And then, as was noted in Ms. Scranton's presentation, those outcomes that there's some empirical evidence of an association with those contaminants that exceeded the health thresholds, we also factored those in. most of those, we had incorporated already, but there were, a few additional ones. And so I think we're casting a very broad net here, and all of those conditions do have some evidence to suggest that, there might be an effect there. So just want to make sure that everybody was aware, of that scenario. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to submit your questions through, Rally Point. Again, for those that have additional questions, in this audience, please submit them in the chat. We will take those under advisement, prepare responses, and they will get posted to, our website so that everybody has a chance to see the questions, and the responses. Here I just kind of took a couple of the questions that were, some of the first ones, that came in, and wanted to just kind of touch base, on those. So if we could have the next slide, please. So one of the questions was asked, will they provide a full and non-redacted report on all the individuals, stationed at K2 and receive diagnosis, and the short answer is, no, we can't do that. That's protected health information. And so sharing that level of detail about individuals is, a violation of privacy, and HIPAA. So, our hands are tied, there. Certainly I wouldn't want my information to be shared out, without my prior knowledge, and consent. And that was kind of a two-part, and then, the second part was, are all cancers, sicknesses, diseases that service members, contractors, and trust agents have experienced? And I'm assuming that was asked, will that information be provided? And yes, when we report on analyses that are done as part of the K2 surveillance program, we will provide counts and risk estimates, risk ratios, odds ratios, those kinds of things, but it's reported at the population level, comparing the K2 cohort versus the comparison groups. And where data are available, we will compare incidence and prevalence to conditions in the general population. Unfortunately, VA does not have authority or really any way to track health outcomes, in civilian contractors. We don't have access to their data. We don't have contact information for them. And so, that we're really limited to, working with, veterans and service members. Next slide. So here's a good question. I think that we've received a couple like that after I've had a chance to review before these first few ones. But, the question is, they developed serious sinusitis and headaches, and are we covered? And the short answer is yes. Prior to PACT Act, Secretary VA approved 3 respiratory presumptions for all of those that served in Southwest Asia, which includes Uzbekistan and the K2 site, for asthma, sinusitis, and rhinitis. And so most definitely K2 veterans are covered under those 3 presumptions. So, here's information on, submitting a claim if you have one of those 3 conditions and served at K2. And I will note that these slides, will get posted on, the VA's K2 website so that you can get back to this contact information. Next slide. So here someone asked that they have a hearing in July, and can they bring up other conditions, that weren't filed at that hearing, or do they refile for other conditions that they, have developed? And in speaking with our VBA colleagues, they recommend, to refile would be the most expedient way, to address those new conditions, and that the hearing is just going to focus on, what was originally submitted, of that hearing. And so really no need to kind of muddy the waters there, stay focused on that, and then put in the claims for the additional conditions and again, information here. Next slide. I think that may be. Yeah, so before we turn it back to Dr. Irving, I just, again, want to thank everybody for, joining us today and letting us share with you what we're doing, with regards to, K2, across all three of our agency. It truly is a collaborative effort, and we have a number of dedicated, talented people, that are working diligently to try and get a better understanding of, what the potential health effects of your time at K2 might be, so that we can then plan and do a better job of providing care and benefits across the board. So with that, I will just remind folks, if you have additional questions, thoughts, comments, please enter them in the chat. We will take them under advisement and respond to them on the website. Thank you very much. And Dr. Irving, back to you.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Culpepper. So to close out today's community forum, a few pieces of information. The K2 community forums will take place annually. There is the possibility of future additional meetings when reports or others available. Thank you to all of those who sent in questions to Rally Point and ones who posted in the chat today. The questions posted to Rally Point and the chat, along with responses, will be posted to the VA K2 website. I'm including both the K2 website along with the Rally Point website on this slide. Next slide, please. Again, we look forward to future community forums, and thanks to everyone for attending today.
This was scheduled 9 to 12. Why can't there be discussion, comment?
I agree with that other guy was saying earlier.
Thank you for attending. If you have other questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat so we can research them and get answers posted on our website. Thank you.
We also posted stuff point two that never got answered in the Rally Point.
Exactly. You had to schedule for. You had to schedule till noon. Excuse me.
The Rally Point, the questions on the Rally Point site will be addressed within the next couple weeks. Responses will be posted there. Thank you.
So listen, but don't listen.
That wasn't even posted in our invite. It said that the questions and answers would have been answered from the Rally Point during this meeting. So what was the point of this meeting? We submitted the questions and we never got answers.
The questions will be responded to on the Rally Point site. Thank you.
It sounded like
basically what she's saying is I don't have answers and I'm just stalling, and I don't have the guts to answer any of your questions. So just go away, people.
At this point, I think everyone here needs to start reaching out to their congressman, and
we do. Our congressmen don't want to talk to us. We do. We reach out to them. Keep muting me. Keep it up. Keep muting me. Everybody, They purposely are muting me over and over and over again because they don't want to answer questions, even though this is supposed to go till noon.
They're doing it to everybody. Thanks, government.
Yeah, you guys should be proud of yourselves. Proud of yourselves.
Can you go back one slide so we can see the Rally Point website again, please? Can you at least do that?
Oh, look, they are there.
Yeah, they
so,
will you guys email us the slides?
Why isn't Executive Order 13982 being adhered to? That's my question. What does race have to do with any kind of research? Okay, you're gonna. Why didn't you guys dig instead of using wipes? You made the troops dig into the dirt, so why wasn't the dirt dug into to see what was in there?
When we were building that place, I uncovered a gas mask.
Why do you not have a roster from the DOD to reflect every single person that was stationed there? Why are you only relaying on the VA when people aren't fully have their claims in. And you're telling people to submit claims when the VA is backlogged by over 400,000 claims. Do you have
Bingo.
any answers to that? And why
Right on
why
point.
isn't there a
Bingo.
mortality
Great point.
roster?
These are all excellent questions. I love to hear an answer.
They're not going to answer because they keep muting me. So, wondering, keep muting me over and over, and I can keep unmuting it.
This is exactly what they done to the vets, Vietnam veterans with the Agent Orange.
Yes, and that makes everybody know that this is now on purpose. They know what they're doing. They willfully know. They knew what that ground was used for before they even stationed people there. They knew it in 1993. At least they had satellite images. They knew what it was used for, and yet they still sent you. Who made that decision? I did. Who made that decision? I want to know the people that made that choice. And for all of you people out there that say that different people made the choice, different people in office, actually, that's not true. Mark Milley was there. He made a lot of these decisions. A whole bunch of people that are now higher up in office made these decisions. So let's see the paperwork of who decided that it was a good idea to put a base and a Soviet. Why? Because the Soviet Union so smartly. Look how many times they're muting me. They're muting me because I have valid questions and they don't want them answered over and over again. They can't take the time to actually answer the questions, but they can take the time to mute me. Go figure on that.
Yeah, when we built K2, and then we were there on October 10th, and we uncovered used Russian gas masks and all kinds of stuff. They knew it was hot back then. Whatever came out of the 20th SF report.
To know basis. They thought we was on a need to know basis about the depleted uranium when I was there. A need to know basis. Really? We needed to know that.
I can tell you this. I grew up.
When I was 26.
The surveyors of 728th Engineer Detachment did a map with Geiger counters of K2. They found the highest spots of radiation under the engineers' tents, the MP's tents, the medical staff's tents, all along the berm where what we call the Skittles ponds, the sewage ponds. That was all the main hot spots of K2.
Do you know where we can find that report? Because
I don't. I've asked several times what's happened to that map.
Yeah, because my crew, we were the Air Force engineers that built CE compound and all the tents and everything else. So I would love to find that report.
Yeah, I'm more concerned about the chemical weapons that were stored in the
2003.
I'm more concerned about the leaking chemical weapons that were stored in the bunkers that we used as our TOCs.
Oh, you mean the same ones that we built roads out of?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Hey,
we had bioenvironmental come in and test for these chemical and biological weapons.